Okay, next on stage is Pete Kercher. He's a former executive officer for the Bureau of European Designer Association and also a founder member of EIDD, Design for All European. He's a roving ambassador since 2007. He writes articles and manifestos for political, legal, and design publications, provides strategic design consultancy to many international projects, and, well, shortly speaking, he's thinking how design can be used in political decision making. So that's what we are going to hear about. Peace by Design, a new look at the world's peace agenda. And Pete Kercher. Round of
Thank you.
applause.
Thank you. I think I need to premise this before I start with the formal presentation, because my colleagues who have just been speaking have told you about their organizations, and I didn't put anything about my organization into my presentation. So I need to say a couple of words about that. I need to tell you what Design for All Europe and now Design for All Global, we're going to change in due course, what it is, where it comes from. And before I even do that, I have to say thank you to my friends from Kaunas European Capital of Culture 2022 for the invitation to come here to speak. And I'm very proud to say that Kaunas European Capital of Culture 2022 has been a member of our network since the very beginning of their work. So way back in 2018 when we started working together. And I want to salute them. I want this to go on record that it is very, very rare indeed that a European Capital of Culture has a 5-year lead-in program of activities, not just the 1 year of Capital of Culture, but 5 years of work preparatory to the year, which has made an enormous impact. I've seen the changes taking place here. I first came here in 2018, and believe me, for those of you who it's the first time that you've been here, you don't know what it was like 5 or 6 years ago and the enormous changes that have taken place. And that a great deal of that has been due to the hard work of the Kaunas team. So I think they deserve to be recorded for that. Jonathan, I want to thank you for doing most of my work, for communicating the importance of the serious approach of the design profession, because I don't know about the rest of you, but I am sick and tired of seeing design being communicated as superfluous, luxurious, unusable, useless, expensive, the message which is always, always, always put across by the media. And if we don't get that right, friends, we're never going to get anywhere. Because we can be as serious as we want to, but if the message that goes across to the decision makers is one about being flippity jippet, superficial, luxury lovers who spend all their time looking at their own navel and telling each other how wonderful they are, we are not going to get the message across at all. So we need to do some fundamental rethinking about that as well. My organization, anyway, is now going to celebrate its 30th anniversary next year at our General Assembly, which will be in Bratislava in April at the Primate's Palace. And we have grown from being an organization that set out, first of all, to bring together the world of disability and the world of design, to make the world a better place for people with disabilities, to being an organization that very soon realized that that would just make a new ghetto again. And so what we had to do was to reset and realize that we have to design for human diversity. And that's why Design for All is defined in our Stockholm Declaration, which we passed in 2004 as Design for Human Diversity, Social Inclusion, and Equality. Intention, it took us 1 year to write 1 page, because any fool can write something, a Bible, in 1 week. But to get it in 1 page, we worked together collaboratively with our friends and neighbors in the design community all over the world, people like Giancarlo Liprandi, who was president of Ecograda years ago. Many of you also contributed, or the people who were representing your organizations at the time also contributed, so that we could have a 1-pager, because decision makers in the public and private sector have to read that 1 page themselves and not give it to their assistant to summarize, who will make their summary and not our summary. So that's why we did it. Now, my topic today is going to be a little bit diverse, a little bit different. I want to talk about peace by design. And what do I mean by that? Well, we're going to see that now. I believe that design is wasted if it only talks about products. Designers have a fantastic ability, a trained ability to analyze, to criticize, and to create innovative responses. Our members, in fact, 42 members in 21 European countries, plus 5 others in outside Europe, one in the States, one in Mexico, one in China, one in Australia, and the latest edition, one in Libya. Those members, what they all share, they're not all design associations, but they all share a fundamental belief in the ability of design to be the channel for creating innovative responses to the challenges of a rapidly changing world. And that way we bring them together in an interdisciplinary way, all sorts of different organizations. So the context is this one. This was the very first time I was here in 2018. Designing happiness was the slogan that was chosen by Kaunas European Capital of Culture. But you cannot have happiness in a world that is based on tension, in a world where there is no peace. You cannot be happy. We cannot be happy, truly happy, if we live in fear, if we live in tension. So, what is the role of design? Let's look at the classical approach to peace, first of all. There's a war. One side wins, conventionally. The winning side imposes its conditions on everybody else, and then it writes the history and calls the result peace. In other words, if they hit you, you hit them back harder, and then you justify what you've done by rewriting history and telling yourself that you are good and they are the war criminals. Usually, there's war criminality on both sides. By the way, I first thought about this back in 2008, and I was thinking about the sterile and useless Camp David Accords between Israel and Palestinians. They were not getting anywhere. I cut that part out of this presentation now because Camp David is part of the past. But the need for peace now in our societies is far more pressing than it was even then. This is the late 20th century approach. The world was a global community full of tensions. So this is back at the time of the Camp David Accords. Every now and then, those tensions would break out into a so-called localized war, not between the superpowers, but they were taking place on behalf of the superpowers somewhere where it wouldn't hurt us, somewhere else. Afghanistan, somewhere in Africa. Who cares? It doesn't matter about them, does it? If they die, we don't care. This was the cynical attitude that our governments and our societies had for many, many years. Then neither side could actually be allowed to win completely because that would upset the balance between the great powers. So the great powers would impose conditions, write the history, call the result peace, and then give each other a pat on the back and a Nobel Peace Prize. And at the first opportunity, the tensions would break out again, maybe in the same place, maybe somewhere else. And then the whole thing started again, the whole cycle. And whether that had anything to do with Nobel or not is another matter. Now we're in the 21st century, and let's be frank about it. The United Nations model of peace has broken down. The Security Council is worse than useless. It's counterproductive. It's not doing us any good when one of the worst aggressors can place a veto in the Security Council and wash its conscience white, at least for itself. Because now the solutions which have been imposed by the experts from above, they're not sustainable anymore in a globalized world. And does that sound familiar to you as designers? Because it's the same message as the solutions imposed in the design world for products, places, systems. Anything imposed from above by the so-called experts simply doesn't work anymore in a complex world. People don't accept them anymore. So we need a paradigm change in the peace process. And human history is a series of paradigm changes. And I'm going to discuss one that is more familiar to a design audience, the design paradigm, the human society paradigm. Uh, the design paradigm is this, and you touched on it, Jonathan. In the industrial age, our predecessors, the designers at the beginning of the 19th, at the beginning of the 20th century, they designed and produced for a predetermined arithmetic average, because that sort of thing went into the system of manufacturing on the production line, and we were maximizing the production of standardized products, and everybody had to adapt to them. But then you see, the question is, they were made for so-called average users, but what or who is average? What is an average human being? Can we talk in categories here or identify an average person between these two women? This is taken from a communication project in Sweden done several years ago. Two Swedish women, two Swedish citizens, both going swimming. Is there an average between those two? If there is, it's a nonsense. It's like saying if you want an average between an average number of wheels on a vehicle, you take all the vehicles in a city and divide it divide it by the number of vehicles. Take all the wheels, sorry, and divide it by the number of vehicles. So with trucks and buses and cars and bicycles, you may end up with a figure like 5.2 wheels. Is that a sensible thing to design for a vehicle with 5.2 wheels or 3.8 wheels because it's the arithmetic average? Does that really sound sensible to design for that? And if so, if that is not sensible, why should we be thinking that human beings are more average and that we can design for human beings who are average in the same way? Would these two societies be at war with each other if it weren't for the interference of the so-called experts, the political experts, who have put the fears and expanded the perception of difference between them? Those experts, of course, they knew what was good for you. Just like at the beginning of the 20th century, the experts knew what was good for people, for consumers. Designs were created for uses and for users, identified in advance and imposed top down. The new design for all paradigm shapes the design brief to ensure that the result caters for a wide diversity of users. We base it on human diversity as the baseline, not on identified personas. Different users and their experience are included actively in the design process. We're not so much into co-design, I have to say that. If you get a committee designing a horse, you get a camel. The designer has the role of controlling, of being the orchestral conductor. When you go into a concert hall, you hear a cacophony. That's all the individual instruments are tuning up. The sound is really unpleasant. Unless, of course, it's a concert by Eric Satie, and then it's intentional. But you get that bad sound. It's a cacophony, okay, from the Greek. Now, the orchestral conductor comes in with his baton, hits on the desk, and then from that moment on, the instruments intervene only at the moment and for the duration that the score says. And that is the role of the designer, to make all these different experts intervene at the moment and for the duration that the design process demands. And then you get a symphony, friends, not a cacophony. Our world at the moment out there is mostly a cacophony. There's not much symphony out there. There's so much work for designers to do that I don't even know where to start. But we really need to look at the world in that respect. Users in the design for all process are recognized as experiencers, as potential experts. Everybody has something useful to say in that process. And the classical design responses to identifiable categories consist in what we call add-ons. Oh, well, let's add on a ramp here or add on a bit of braille there for people who can't see. We'll add something else. And yeah, every time you add something on, it becomes more expensive because you haven't thought of human diversity when you start doing your design. By its very nature, that add-on is more expensive solution than thinking in the beginning of an approach that would include people in question. The more add-ons you have, the more it costs you. And then the stronger is the argument for a different way, a better way of designing, going about creating the design brief. Because designers are perfectly capable of being inclusive, but they have to be allowed to do so. And they're only allowed to do so if decision makers give them the space in the brief to do so. So we have to talk to the decision makers as well and make them understand the potential of design. Decision makers in the private sector, but also in the public sector. Similarly, an imposed top-down approach to peace is more expensive as a solution than an approach that includes the people in question in the original design brief. Because it's not really a solution at all. It's merely an expedient. The more you impose expedients from above in a situation of tension, the more you will alienate participants, and lay the foundations for repeated explosions of tension, the ones that I mentioned before, somewhere else in the world. More wars, in other words. In fact, although people want peace, they don't want just any old peace. They want a just peace. And a peace that is not perceived as favoring the other side more than themselves, because that is only a recipe for disaster. Eventually, it means that the retaliation is put off, but it will explode. It doesn't work like that. And this is not achieved by closeting political leaders together in the past at Camp David, these days in the United Nations Security Council, where they give each other that classical pat on the back and say, well, we tried with negotiation. The only way is by building peace by design. This is the human society paradigm. From the caveman, our ancestors, and that's how we still react now with our world, with our wars. Well, the next slide will be to what it is, to the, well, yes, okay, to the modern city. A few pics of Kaunas taken during past visits. I want to stress the fact that with these people, these are the ones we descend from. They ran faster and they escaped whenever there was a danger, wild animals, an earthquake, whatever. As a result of that, we have tens of thousands of years of imprinting in us, which says, hostile environment, I have to adapt to the hostile environment. Otherwise, I die. Okay? We know that we have descended in that way. But there's only one problem. That was good for the hostile environment when it was a natural environment. It's not good when the hostile environment is an urban one. I just use Kaunas here. It's not particularly hostile. Don't get me wrong. No offense to Kaunas. But the artificial environment in which we live is only hostile to the extent in which we have made it hostile ourselves. And that is, frankly, pretty damn stupid. But then we are irrational. We're human beings. We are not rational creatures. We do stupid things. George Bernard Shaw said this years ago: the reasonable man adapts himself to the world. The unreasonable man persists in trying to adapt the world to himself. Therefore, all progress depends on the unreasonable man. These days, we would say person, not man anymore, politically correct. But the issue here is that it is reasonable for us to adapt. It is reasonable for us to make allowances until it becomes unreasonable to be reasonable. We have to reach the point where it is no longer reasonable to be reasonable. The reasonability is unreasonable in itself. We need progress. We have to change, and we have to move and change our paradigm. What does that have to do with peace? Well, I shall draw a parallel by discussing the meaning of safety. That was also mentioned before, safety. We react to danger instinctively like the caveman did. But what is safety? Politicians and public administrators who are particularly interested in public spaces will tend to consider safety to be simply the absence of overt danger. No danger, overt danger equals safety. Private administrators, building managers, and so on will often use the same approach for the private spaces that they administer. Well, what do? In order to achieve safety, they use the add-on approach that I mentioned before. A ramp here, bit of braille there, and they install CCTV cameras and they call for more police controls because that is their approach to achieving safety. It doesn't, actually. It doesn't. Uh, you can progressively reduce speed limits until we all go at a walking pace. But if drivers are not socially aware, there will still be the accidents. It's the Big Brother approach from Orwell's 1984, and it restricts human freedom. And actually, governments don't mind restricting human freedom. They don't mind having a bit more control over us all. But then everything that restricts human freedom inevitably creates increased social tensions. We resent it, and whenever there's resentment, there's more social tension. So, in fact, it works directly against the principle of safety. Wherever there is tension, social tension, there will be less safety, not more. So, although it may appear that having CCTV cameras everywhere is a guarantee of more safety, it's not. It's only window dressing. And it's just like the so called preventive wars, which are actually function directly against peace. Safety is much more than the absence of overt danger. It's a sense of intrinsic security that comes from living, moving, and acting in an environment whose basic precept is an holistic understanding of peace, complete with the respect, tolerance, and acceptance of human diversity. If we don't have that, there will always be tension. Plus, one more factor: awareness of the need and possibility to ensure that the environment itself caters for that human diversity more than just adequately, more than just by more of that reasonable accommodation, the ramps and so on. Like safety, there are two different ways of considering the topic of peace. For most politicians, peace is merely the absence of open, overt warfare. You manage to get some sort of negotiated settlement, and they call that peace. For them, the world experienced peace from 1945 onwards, throughout the Cold War. Really? Was that peace? Those of you who live here in Lithuania, was it peaceful to be under the thumb of the Soviet Union for 45 years? Could that be described as peace? I don't think so. I was a frequent visitor to Eastern Europe under the Soviet regime, and I did not experience an atmosphere of peace. And to be honest, I didn't experience an atmosphere of peace under the thumb of the United States in Western Europe either. The principle of MAD, that is mutually assured destruction, may be the absence of open warfare, but it was never real peace. Have you ever seen this quotation from Tacitus from the Agricola? Obviously, he invented this as a speech by a Brythonic leader from the north of the island of Britain. They made a desert and called it peace. This was describing the Roman victory. They made a desert and called it peace. The Romans came, they killed tens of thousands of natives until there was nobody left, and they called it peace. Is that the sort of peace we want? There has to be more to peace than just a desert. Whether it's in the first century Britannia or in 21st century Ukraine. And there is more to it. For true pacifists, peace is a positive state of society that requires constant attention and gradual development. You cannot do it overnight. You can't do it by having top-down accords. No peace can exist between communities if it does not exist between the individuals who make up those communities. Peace must be rooted in societal models, constituting a fundamental factor in the way we behave towards each other. And peace is built on an holistic approach of respect for others, tolerance, and the acceptance and celebration of human diversity. Proactively constructed peace is ultimately the purpose of Design for All, which, as I said before, is designed for social inclusion, human diversity, and equality. It's a political agenda. It is design applied to a political agenda. Let's be absolutely clear about that. Design for All starts out from the assumption of human diversity to achieve social inclusion and guarantee equality for everyone. Instead of making reasonable accommodation, reasonable provisions for special categories of people, it assumes human diversity as its basic precept. It's a complete changeover, it's a paradigm change. Special categories for design today are people with disabilities and the elderly, or it could be the aging population. Children would be in a distinct minority in 50 years' time. Immigrants, whether permanent or temporary, migrants, religious, ethnic, sexual minorities. We can't put them all into watertight containers, little boxes, and deal with them separately. It simply doesn't work. Every time we talk in terms of special categories for design, even if it's a wonderful aim, a laudable aim of including them, what we're actually doing is creating another ghetto, another form of social discrimination. That is a design message. And what is its relevance to the peace agenda? A peace process that is based on catering for special categories only will simply be fated to create new cases of social discrimination in the same way. For example, after a millennium of inhuman treatment, culminating in the Second World War, the winners of that war washed their consciences clean when they catered for the special category of Jews by establishing the State of Israel in Palestine. They had a dirty conscience, so they imposed the result on other people. And it's a discrimination against both the resident Arabs and the Jews in the region, who have been paying an appalling price ever since. Continuous tension ever since 1945. It could have been avoided if the British had not conducted their Palestinian mandate so irresponsibly. And they could have involved the communities, but they didn't. They found it easier to divide and rule. It was much easier. Dividere et imperat has always been, always was, the leitmotif for the British Empire. They were not interested in the welfare of the people they ruled. They were interested only in dominance. I say that as someone who still holds a British passport. But they made cynically conflicting promises in the Balfour Declaration. The Balfour Declaration to the Jewish community, and other promises to the Arabs before the involvement in the First World War. Conflicting promises that led to the tension that we have now. Similarly, certain Western governments tried to make up for one historical mistake by making another in the Western Balkans. The first mistake was when the United States, Britain, and France created Yugoslavia in 1919. This was compounded when they refused to recognize the independence of its constituent republics in 1990. Some other countries did, but those three didn't. Serbia interpreted that refusal as a carte blanche to do what they wanted in the Western Balkans. And we saw the result. The second was when NATO then reversed its policy and backed Kosovo's independence against Serbia, which in practice meant the expulsion of the Kosovo Serbs. So again, it was the Kosovo Serbs that suffered this time. Before it was the Bosniaks, then it was the Kosovo Serbs. All the time taking their attention and placing it in some other country for localized conflicts to keep the great powers happy. It could have been avoided by a real peace in 1919 instead of Wilson's infantile straight line borders. Woodrow Wilson had no idea about the complexity of multicultural, multi-ethnic communities that were throughout the Balkans. He thought he could draw straight lines, nice, neat straight lines like between the States and the United States. Until Wilson, people had lived together in multicultural communities, often in creative cross-fertilisation, though not always peacefully. Let's not get to the idea that it was some sort of nirvana before. The Austrians, Hungarians, Czechs, Poles, Ukrainians, Slovaks, Slovenes, Croatians, Serbs, and Romanians in Austria-Hungary, they coexisted reasonably well, certainly better than they did after 1919. The Muslims, Mozarab Christians, and Jews in medieval Iberia. The Armenians, Greeks, Arabs, Jews, Circassians, Druzes, and Maronites in early 20th century Syria. I've already mentioned the Stockholm Declaration. We have this quotation about how the practice of design for all makes conscious use of the analysis of human needs and aspirations, and requires the involvement of end users at every stage of the design process. This is available in about 25, 30 languages on our website, including Lithuanian, of course, but also you'll find it also in Russian and Chinese, Arabic, and so on, because we have to have a method. Who are the users? Everybody who is involved from the beginning to the end. I don't need to go through this again because Jonathan mentioned it very well. He described it perfectly. Everybody, right through to the ones who know how to recycle the objects after they've finished their life cycle. And who are the users in the peace process? Everyone who is involved in the potential or open conflict. And that's not only the politicians, very often warlords like Putin, masquerading as self-appointed representatives of the people, but the people themselves, the inhabitants of the regions that are torn apart every time there is warfare, and those nearby, the homeless, the refugees, the orphans, the abandoned children, the relatives of war victims, the child soldiers, local communities on all sides of every community. The users are not the illegitimate interests of great power domination that aims to share the world in spheres of influence, a concept that's irrelevant to the modern world, as irrelevant as Henry Ford's "you can have your car any color as long as it's black." The Design for All methodology can and should be applied to the peace process. Everything that is designed and made by people to be used by people must be accessible, convenient for everyone in society to use, and responsive to evolving human diversity. Every peace process that is drawn up and put in place by people to be experienced by people must be sustainable, meet with the approval of everyone in society, and respond to evolving human diversity. I'm going to stop here. There are a couple more slides, but I'm going to stop because I already started about 10 minutes late. So I'll stop with that.
Yes. Thank you, Pete. Yeah, thank you for an unexpected take on design for the topic of peace. But now, since we are a little bit over time, we are going to have a break of 10 minutes. So if you have any questions, you can stay here and
Yeah,
ask
come
me
to me,
directly.
ask me
Yes.
during the coffee break. Okay.
Yeah. Let's have a 10-minute coffee break. Not really after 10 minutes, we are back and we have some more presentations. So 10 minutes. And